Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 229. We're going to be doing some ghost stories here again. So, last week we had an analysis episode. We talked about Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest and kind of went over their entire career in the Civil War and kind of did a little bit of an analysis on them. I think one of the big points that you can make for Forrest versus Stuart and who was the more effective cavalier, if you will, for the South, because really, while there are some other names that you could throw in there, these are really the two main guys, you could say. If you're going to really take a look at their service and decide who is superior, I think they have two very different impacts on the battlefield, whether it's Nathan Bedford Forrest, who's more of a combat leader, right? His troops are less in terms of your conventional cavalry. They are more of your combat shock troops, light horse, getting to a position quickly and then being able to move rapidly away as well. And then you have Jeb Stuart, who is pretty valuable when it comes to Robert E. Lee and intelligence gathering, right? We have our famous rides around the Army, and in many cases with these, really the important factor is that he is getting accurate intel on where the Union Army is. And that's also why Gettysburg is kind of a dark spot on Jeb Stuart's career, right? Because he's not there to provide this valuable service that Robert E. Lee has come to rely on, right? And it's not so much that he did what he did, it's really the route and the fact that he just wasn't there, right, when you needed him the most. So if you take a look at those where one is definitely a stronger combat leader, the other is stronger in intelligence, and then you kind of combine their service and kind of really think about it, where is Braxton Bragg at a disadvantage because he doesn't have accurate intel? He doesn't always. So you could probably see Jeb Stuart thriving in that theater, maybe not thriving in the sense of being in Mississippi and kind of waging a war against the Union troops there. So he probably might not have done well there, whereas Nathan Bedford Forrest is more suited to that kind of role and more into the disruption in the area, and he's very much familiar with that part of the United States. So you could definitely have that as your argument versus Jeb Stuart, who's once again more of your conventional cavalry leader. And for what you're really wanting for him in the two main theaters of the war, you have your east and then your sub-theater, if you will, the west, then he's probably more valuable in those particular theaters. So just a little recap, a little food for thought there on the two Confederate cavalry leaders. And obviously we had a full episode about that last week. This week we're going to do something a little bit different. We've done it before, so I guess it's not too different. However, we are going to get away from our analysis episodes, from our redo episodes, and we are going to go back to our ghost stories. And we have done this in the past, where we have read some contemporary accounts from newspapers that are involving the supernatural, right? And we definitely have maybe come to the end here in terms of the stories that we can read off. We've done our Christmas episodes where we've done firsthand accounts of Christmas during the Civil War. I think this is just another interesting look into the mentality of the individuals who are living in this time frame. So we're going to read off a couple of those. Before we get into that, though, I do want to talk about our Patreon content, and we have some episodes that are posted. We recently, this month, did Emancipation, and that's a movie starring Will Smith, and we talked about the historical accuracy of that film. We are going to go back to the well of memoir reviews, and this one we're actually doing a little bit different. We're doing a scout, right? So we've done a whole bunch of different individuals throughout the war, and there's certainly still a whole lot of memoirs that we could go back to and read, but we've done a good kind of variety here of cavalry, infantry, artillery, right? John Singleton Mosby, probably the most famous of these individuals, at least at the time of the Civil War. So we've done those, and now we're going to do something a little bit different in terms of a scout for the Union Army. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, we've done other movie reviews as well. We have done some picture slideshows showing modern day battlefields. That is all in the Patreon. That is in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show, and they are greatly appreciated. So once again, right, we are back here with our ghost stories. And we've talked about this before in the previous episodes that we've done about this, or even if we've mentioned it in passing, in that there is an interesting focus in your Victorian times. You can kind of have these Victorian ideals that we talked about before, where whether it's kind of this sense of duty, of honor, right? Well, they're also having this shift to the interest in terms of the supernatural, right? And there is definitely a trend in that direction. And I think it is also compounded. We have talked before about the mentality of your Civil War soldier, of your civilian as well, on the home front, where the conflict is a little bit different than any that we've really seen before. And what I mean by that, and we've talked about before, where it's a modern war, right? This is the first modern war, they say. But with that modern war, we have an increased ability to create casualties, to take life, right? It's kind of like the World War I idea of trench warfare, and you have these machine guns, these rapid fire machine guns, you have weapons that can reach longer distances, you're starting to have tanks, you have airplanes, you have a lot of different ways to destroy the enemy. And a lot of people have a tough time with that, right? Especially in Europe, because they haven't had something quite like the Civil War, or at least they've had conflicts that are probably similar, but not on this scale, right? So they haven't seen the kind of capacity there is to take a human life. And in the Civil War, this is really the first instance in the United States for sure where you're getting this. And you have mentioned many times before how Shiloh, the total number of casualties in that battle is actually greater than all of the other American wars combined, right? So if you're looking at it on that scale, just something that people haven't seen before. And with that, you also have a randomness, right? There's a lot of accounts that I've seen, whether it's firsthand or contemporary, right? Or even analysis on the mentality of these Civil War soldiers. There's a couple of great books that you can read about the mentality of the Civil War soldier, why they were fighting, what they thought, what they felt, right? But there's a randomness to it. And with that randomness, it becomes this uncertainty of, am I going to be able to make it another day? And you're being able to, once again, have a weapon that has longer distances. If you're getting hit, right? If it's breaking bone, we've mentioned that before, how you have these rifled muskets that are able to break bone. And if that happens, your likelihood of survival goes down, right? And it's not necessarily what you would believe that it's necessarily a death sentence, but certainly does go down. And a lot of people have a tough time of handling that, as you could possibly imagine, right? That's probably an episode in the future where I want to talk about that and really do a little bit more research and go a little bit more in depth in terms of this kind of thought process and the mentality. Well, you have both sides with great examples of how to maybe cope with that. And whether that's before the war, we talked about, you have this great awakening, you have this kind of revival of religion. You have a lot of people who turn to that. You have a lot of people who don't. And there are a lot of examples of that, of people writing how they kind of are losing their faith in some ways, maybe not in the modern sense that we would think, but there are some people who certainly do, and there are some people who kind of turn toward faith to try to see them through, and we have great examples of that in our main characters, shall we say, of the Civil War. You have Stonewall Jackson is a great example of a guy who's like, well, if it's my time, it's my time, right? And that's certainly one way to handle that, and in his mind, right, whether this is right or wrong, you have an individual who says, I have everything in terms of my life, my spirituality is all in check. And then if it's me, if this is my time, I'm ringing the bell for the last time here, then so be it, right? So you do have individuals who have that kind of mentality. And with that spirituality, I think we go hand in hand toward the afterlife. And really, once again, it kind of circles back into this fascination with the supernatural. And certainly, once again, I think it gets increased as we see this civil war. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of things going on. And whether it's kind of, again, a way to cope, or whether it's a distraction, right? Because it is something that a lot of people think of more as a enjoyable thing, right? Like, why do people like horror movies? Because it's enjoyable. It's something that they like to do. They like to watch. It's not really my cup of tea, right? But certainly there are individuals who go out there and they watch that. And this is kind of the same thing, right? Where we have these stories. So just want to go ahead and read off a couple of them just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that are being printed in the newspaper surrounding this subject matter. And the first one we're actually going to read is from a paper here, the Cadiz Democratic Sentinel, and they're actually reprinting a story. So something that would happen, quite often. Really, they're reprinting a story that's from the Richmond Examiner, and the Richmond Examiner would have been one of the more well-known papers of the South. Obviously, proximity to the main Confederate armies there in Virginia, of course, but also certainly circulated enough where, say, like Braxton Bragg is concerned with what's happening in the Richmond Examiner. What are they saying about him, right? So it is more of the well-known papers that you see in the South. So this is going to be from October in 1863, and the title is going to be Supernatural Signs and Omens. But as if to vindicate the poets and supernaturalists, the attention of the credulous has been called of late to two very extraordinary and apparently unaccounted occurrences. Mrs. Temperance Carter, of the town of Marietta, Georgia, or elsewhere being to all intents defunct, was made ready for burial, when suddenly she rose from the dead, and inquired the latest news from the war. The reply was that Bragg was still retreating, that the court of inquiry in the Vicksburg disaster had been dismissed, and that Pemberton was to be restored to his command, whereupon Mrs. Temperance Carter again, and without reluctance, died, permanently, it is supposed, since no tidings of her second resurrection had been received. No consoling interpretation could be given to Mrs. Temperance Carter's singular behavior, and still more marvelous, but less recondite, event was anxiously awaited by the aged females of both sexes throughout the country. Hence the great Greenbrier wonder, which is thus related. During the afternoon of September 1, Mr. Moses Dwyer, an honest, responsible, and unimpeachable farmer, Mrs. Percy, who seems to have a very clear head, two other ladies, a youth almost grown, and a servant girl all saw the side of a hill or mountain 10 miles west of Lewisburg, on which the sun was shining with full power. Something which they were not able to describe with clearness and accuracy, albeit Mrs. Percy's head was probably as clear then as it ever was. They declared nevertheless that this something was masses or bodies of vapor mist or something else of whitish green color, 5 or 6 feet high, and 2 or 3 feet wide, which floated above the tops in a perpendicular position, moving on in line, with the utmost regularity and precision, then passing through the tree tops, without having the line broken or disturbed, and then passing off into the distance. If this whitish green vapor or mist or something else had done nothing more, the exhibition might have been regarded as a common freak of vapor on a mountainside, but then came a countless multitude of men dressed in white, marching up the mountain slope, at a rapid pace, quicker than double quick time, the men seen, not only as a whole, but the individual parts, heads, arms, legs, and feet. Occasionally one would lag behind, and could be distinctly seen to quicken his pace to regain his position in line. They were passing for an hour or more, numbered, it is thought, thousands upon thousands, passed over a field several hundred yards in length, the area of which they were covered in passing. Their general appearance was white, and they were without arms or knapsacks. This is the entire strange story, which it must be confessed beats Mrs. Temperance Carter, the dying prophets, the engraved eggs, and the intermeeting springs of All Hollow. The theory of the refraction of light, which accounts so happily for the wonderful phenomena of the mirage and the Fata Morgana, might also explain the singular spectacle in Greenbrier, if the people of the Confederacy were not predisposed to superstition, and encouraged therein by frequent calls of their attention to religious observances, rather than just appointment of them, and the right application, which only human agencies are involved or need to be involved. Many pretended solutions by Southern visionaries, the latest of whom, Hops, that the northern movement of the whitish-green spectres without arms prognosticates the speedy return of the Vandals, deprived of their means of destruction, to their own homes. It is fortunate for the propounder of this sage interpretation that the vapory or misty or something else, Bounds and Greenbrier, were without weapons, for George Cruikshanks, the comic artist of London, has just published a book to prove that since the days of Pliny the Younger, nobody has pretended that armor, implements of war, shovels, tongs, or any formation of iron brass has a soul, and consequently the ghost of such things could not be. As such, might be declared of the ready-made clothing furnished the Union Army, which far from having a spirit, has scarcely any body. If we may trust the newspaper diatribe against shoddy contractors, it will be prudent, therefore, to maintain, in spite of the vicarious Mrs. Moses Dwyer, the clear-headed Mrs. Percy, and the youth almost grown, that the greenish-white visions witnessed by them appertain more to their excited optics than to the realm of departed spirits, and that, as a general thing, it would be safer for the country to trust to good generals, plenty of gunpowder, and strong armies, than to the greenish-white ghosts going up the side of the hill at Greenbrier. But the question, after all, rests with Mrs. Temperance Carter, who may emerge any day from the tomb and be anxious to impact information from the other world, as she was some time ago, to take it from this. So this one definitely has a comical tone, right? Like, there is some people who think they saw something right here in the Greenbrier story. The Mrs. Temperance Carter story is definitely more for fun, right? Because she's, awakening from the grave and then realizing that, things are still not really going well for the Confederacy. And then she's like, all right, whatever. Right. That's kind of like what you get from the first part of that story. It's kind of like what you hear, you see these kind of memes out there or images where it's like, I want my pallbearers to be my favorite sports teams because then they can let me down one last time. It's kind of reminiscent of that. Right. Well, we have that in this story. And then seemingly it could be these people think they did see something, but it's kind of like poo-pooing that a little bit in terms of like, let's not really worry about these ghosts. Let's just go ahead and put more faith into the Confederacy. So there you go. You have that story here. Now, the next one is actually going to be another story. This one's going to be from Chicago. And it's going to be a ghost on board the Great Eastern. On the 11th, Captain W. Peyton, while addressing the members of the Mercantile Marine Association in reference to the plan for repairing the big ship, mentioned a singular occurrence which took place in New York. An impression got aboard that the ship was haunted, the alleged ghost being no other than the impersonation of an unfortunate riveter, who was heard plying his avocation in one of the wells or compartments. Captain Peyton stated that before the vessel left this country, he believed that one of the men employed in her construction was missing. The man was a riveter. He was missed from the ship and never came up for his wages, the supposition being that he had been riveted up in some part of the vessel. So firmly impressed were some of the men with this idea that they left the ship in consequence. They affirmed that they had heard their departed friend busily engaged riveting in the middle of the night. The story was believed by many persons in New York, and on one occasion while the ship was under repair, a diver signaled up to be drawn. He appeared pale with fright, and declared the ghost of the riveter was busy in the bottom part of the ship. In fact, that he began immediately over his head. Such was the consternation among the divers that they called in the aid of one of the spirit mediums, who are somewhat numerous in the city of New York. The medium came on board the ship, and after an examination declared that the missing man was there, both in body and spirit. Fortunately, he, Captain Peyton, by pure accident was enabled to dispel the illusion. Being in a boat near the bows of the ship, he discovered that a swivel connected with the moorings worked to and fro, the movement causing a chink or vibration which at times, more especially at night, was heard throughout the vessel. It was this sound that had conjured up in connection with the supposed fate of the unfortunate riveter, the phantom whose mysterious doings spread such consternation on board the big ship. So this one was a little bit different, right? It kind of has a more factual kind of tone to it than anything else. It does kind of point out here in the end that the culprit is not in fact a ghost, right? But it is kind of an interesting thing to read in that you see a lot of ships, right? Especially if you're kind of like me and you like to go see historical vessels, right? Which maybe you do, maybe you don't. But, you go to these places and you see a lot of historical vessels and, some of them are like, say, World War II battleships. And there are a lot of individuals who have these as hotspots for the supernatural, right? So it's kind of like the same thing in the sense of it's also a vessel, and, you know, somebody died where they're working on it or serving on it, right? And then their spirit is still there. So there's always kind of been this fascination, I guess, with vessels in that sense. So you can kind of connect that to the modern day. Now, it also kind of points out here, and again, in a more factual sense, in that there's a lot of mediums in New York. So everyone needs to call this medium so we can communicate with the ghost. And that kind of gives you, once again, an idea about just how popular this had become during the Civil War, during this time period, even before the war, where you have a lot of individuals who are trying to reach out to loved ones in the past, or whether they need to talk to somebody who's dead, right? Kind of gives you an idea of, there's a famous Japanese film, and it's actually a Kurosawa film, so it's actually one of the more famous ones here, Rashomon. That is a movie about the trial of a murder, essentially, and at one point, they put on trial the ghost of the murdered samurai. So he's a witness at his own trial, I guess, right? And they need to have this medium come in and talk, and it's pretty well done scene. I think it's a good movie overall, so if you're into that, obviously it's a black and white film, and it definitely check that one out if you haven't seen it, but certainly it kind of gives off that vibe of, well, we need to have this individual who can come talk to this guy, and maybe he can stop riveting in the middle of the night, or riveting and scaring these divers. There's also another actually show that was on AMC called The Terror, and you can kind of think about how a diver at this time would definitely be spooked by a lot of things, right? You know, they're kind of connected to this kind of piping, right, so that they can breathe underwater, right, and to repair the sides of vessels. And obviously the Terror is a little bit later than the Civil War, but it does have a great scene, probably the scariest scene of the show, really, is there's a diver who's under the water, and he thinks he sees something. So I'll just go ahead and leave it like that. So you can probably understand how there would be an individual who, given the time period and also the occupation, they would probably be pointing to a ghost as a culprit for this. We'll go ahead and read another account here, and this one is going to be about a ghost sighting. This one's going to be from the Burlington, Iowa Weekly Hawkeye. Ghost, ghost, ghost. An apparition, robed in white, was seen by a number of persons last night about 11 o'clock, gliding noiselessly along the top of the walls at the rear of the building occupied by Kellogg and Burge. Back and forth, went the apparition, with noiseless, almost invisible step, several times, and then disappeared. By those who saw it, and the moon being quite bright, its every outline was distinctly visible. It is described as being about 6 feet tall, and looking like a man, attired in the habiliments of the tomb. It has been seen several nights in succession, just as the clock struck 11, and has excited considerable alarm in the immediate neighborhood. About 25 persons witnessed its appearance last night, and gazed speechless awe upon the picture. The interest is becoming more intense, and large numbers will watch it nightly until the mystery is explained. And then here we have another postal short snippet here, also from the Burlington Weekly Hawkeye. Another ghost. A house occupied by a family named Simmons, out beyond the cemetery, it is asserted, is haunted by the ghost of a woman. The specter, it is pretending, was seen Wednesday night, and the occupants of the building are badly frightened. The matter has created quite an excitement in the neighborhood. So these are more like your run-of-the-mill sort of less story, right, than they are just kind of like matter-of-fact things. And we actually read one, I think, in our last episode that we did that was like this, where it turned out there's kind of like a string of these stories, and maybe, again, it's maybe for amusement purposes, we're having a couple of them, back to back, and then all of a sudden it gets sort of thrown out that it's actually just some guy walking around, right? And that's kind of like the big joke, and maybe it was known beforehand and maybe not. But also, once again, we're looking at it more in terms of maybe amusement purposes. And even then, right, we also talked about one that is completely humorous. It was kind of like a string of them as well, where people would be walking by the cemetery, and it turned out to just be two people making noise. And it was kind of like playing on, I guess, the naive attitude of some people, where There were two people that were either drunk making noise and just kind of yelling. And there were these individuals who were walking by the cemetery and thought they were ghosts just because it was in the cemetery. And so the article kind of played that up a little bit. That we've read one of those in the past. So, you kind of see some of these that are sort of just a couple sentences long that are just printed in these newspapers. All right, so let's go ahead and read another one here. And this one is going to be from Wheeling. This one is a little bit different because it's talking about a somnambulist. And that is a sleepwalker. I guess that's the technical term. You learn something new every day. I actually didn't know that's what that was called. But so this one is a little bit of a different take here. But this one's from Wheeling, West Virginia, here in 1865. A somnambulist. We've lately heard of the strange doings of a woman residing in the 3rd Ward, who is the somnambulist, and who, unless the doors of the room in which she sleeps are well secured, leaves the house attired in her night clothes, and walks about the premise and through the streets. She was the occasion, something like a year ago, of much anxiety on the part of her friends, but she has recently appeared to have altogether abandoned the practice of taking nocturnal rambles, and it has been thought necessary to place a watch upon her movements or secure the doors and windows. Latterly, however, she has resumed the practice. One night last week she left her house and repaired to that of a friend and acquaintance, and knocking upon the door, was admitted and placed upon a bed, where she remained until morning and woke up very much surprised to find herself on strange premises. On another occasion she left her bed, and took up her quarters in an old vehicle which stood in the carriage house adjoining the premises, where she was shortly afterwards found by her friends. On Friday night she left her room, and took a promenade down the street upon which she resides, and encountered the belated individual to whom we are indebted for this information. Our friend's nerves being none of the strongest, he allowed himself to suppose that she had been sent from the other world. He wheeled about, ran a distance of about 2 squares, concealed himself behind a tree box, and commenced saying the only prayer he knew, "Now I lay me down to sleep." He was fortunately discovered in this demoralized condition by another gentleman, who inspired our friend with sufficient courage to induce him to approach the supposed ghost. The somnambulist was soon found, and being recognized, was escorted to her house. So there you go. This one's a little bit of a kind of a comedic take, I guess. Here you have an individual who is actually suffering from a real condition, and then you have this individual who is going to think that she is in fact a ghost. And you actually see that trope a lot in horror movies, come to think of it. So I guess that kind of is a good connection to the past, that even sleepwalking is kind of scary, right? In some senses, right? You could have, whether it's you're being controlled by somebody, right? It's a common trope that you see in these movies, or whether, you don't know where you're going to end up. And certainly, once again, that's a trope that you see quite frequently. So this is an interesting connection. Even back in the Civil War times, it was a trope. So here we go. Let's read another one here. And this one is going to be from the Ottawa Free Trader. And it is, again, from 1865. And the title is A Good Old-Fashioned Ghost in Pennsylvania. The town of Bristol, Pennsylvania, according to the Philadelphia Press Correspondent, has a haunted house where a ghost of the most approved style holds midnight revel to the great alarm of the townsfolk. Here are some particulars. What the ghost does. This fine mansion is deserted. On dark nights or at the midnight hour is avoided, and the luckless wight who has to pass it walks on tiptoe, like the opposing pickets used to do on the peninsula when a soldier in the copse was unwittingly exposing himself to death. Moans have been heard to come through the gaping, broken windows, shrieks, imprecations, soliloquies, and if there was something or somebody in agony, something or somebody that wanted to die, yet was commanded to live. And lights often glare out in darkness, or pass by windows with such rapidity as to leave a long line of light behind. But the appearances are not by night alone, but by day also. The orgies of the ghost do not disappear, like mountain mists before the sun. In sunlight as well as by the glimpse of the moon, the spirit walks to the affright even those who are bold enough to enter within the haunted precincts. Its manifestations differ in the daytime, however. A few days ago, 2 skeptical young ladies, learning that ghosts could be seen at precisely 6 in the morning, determined to brave ghostly displeasure by entering his domain and plucking a wildflower or two. They went as promised, to the affright of servants, who were surprised at the unwonted early rising, and now let them tell their own tale. So here you have the actual account here. The sun had gone up when we got to the gate. When we opened it, it creaked on its rusty hinges, and went back again with a slam after we had passed through. That frightened us a little, but still we kept on right through the tangled hair grass in the path, and the twisted stems of boxwood, wet with dew, went around the side of the house, right to the back, where there is a large flower bed that has been growing to weeds, and growing longer than I am growing old. We went right up to the flower bed, and Annie was just pulling a sprig of geranium, when there came a rapping, such a rapping at the window just over our heads. A little shudder, and shower of tiny pebbles. Where they came from, we didn't know. We were frightened, I tell you, but we weren't going to give up. So we tried to get a flower again, and then there was a rapping again, only quicker and louder than before, a shuffling of feet and a groan. We looked up at the window but saw nothing, and then we ran away as fast as we could, and I fell down in the tangled path of the gate. Here we have another account as well. The manifestation at night have more of horror for susceptible and superstitious minds and weak nerves, for darkness invests with terror, what daylight shows even to be quite usual and commonplace. I will not enter into detailed description of them, but give you the statement of an old farmhand who, after speaking of the haunted mansion, gave his own experience. "You see, sir," he said, while he stopped his horse, he was pawing at this time, and gathered up the rein ends in the lump of his brawny fist. "You see, sir, I was just the way I am now." He wore a shirt and muddy kersey, pants tucked into his boots, and a battered straw hat. "I was going down to the store for the old man, and I had a bit of a kettle in my hand, and a big basket slung over my shoulder. I walked along first rate until I got down to that place," nodding his head towards the mansion, with a motion half muscular, half nervous. "I felt queerish like, and hitched myself up to go by right and square. It was only about 9 o'clock or thereabouts. It might be close to 10. What should I see when I got to the far end of the fence but a tall person in white, with a brown kind of handkerchief on his head, and had a candle in one of them old-fashioned candlesticks. I walked along on the tops of flowers in the box bush, and didn't bend them. Ah, was my involuntary exclamation, when I assumed an air of great interest and entire belief. "Yes, sir," said the plowman decisively, "and it walked right toward me, and then I got up and left, and that's all I know." "And do you really believe in the existence of the ghost?" "Well, I guess I do," answered he, decisively. "Has not everybody believed it these 20 years gone?" We did not demur, but left him, and wondered how anybody in the Bucks County could believe in ghosts at this day. It was an evidence of want of knowledge, as well as superstition. But Bristol was an old borough, and it was a Democratic county. That explained the matter, partially. Who the ghost is, that I cannot tell you. There are many intimations of black deeds in that old house years ago, and 15 other conjectures are one usually indulged in such cases. Those who have seen the ghost all differ in their descriptions of him or her, so that the oldest inhabitant cannot fix anybody, once in the flesh but now departed, who looks like it. The property, it is said to be owned by a lady in your city, who does not occupy it because she is afraid. She knows not who the ghost is, only that he or she is. So there you go, you have another little tale here about a ghost. And this one, I think, is also a little bit different than the other ones that we have read, because there was a little bit of investigative journaling in there, right? We went ahead and interviewed some people firsthand of these accounts. And, again, if we're talking about our kind of horror movie tropes and what we see in the modern day, your haunted house is obviously a big one, right? You still see that in movies to this day, and you still see that as an attraction for people, right? So not only do you see it as, again, in these stories, but you also see it as where people go to have fun, right? And so that's why you have a story like this where we have this haunted house. It seems like almost a gold mine of being able to write about this in the paper, right? Where you're saying, hey, not only do we have this haunted house, we have this ghost, we have this haunted house. And that's why I think it's actually one of the longer passages that we have read in these different newspaper accounts, because there's so much to go off of, especially if you're trying to, once again, come up with something that's enjoyable for your readers. So we'll go ahead and put a pause there, and I think we've done a good couple of these in past episodes and in this episode, so we might not take a full episode in the future to read more. But certainly there are a couple more that I could probably find and dig up here, and we might do that in our sub episodes that we're doing, our little mini episodes. So maybe we'll revisit this again. But once again, as we're getting here into October, we're getting into the spooky season, I decided it might be a good idea to roll this one out. So hopefully you found reading those to be enjoyable. And next week's episode, do not worry, do not fear. We're going back to our analysis episodes. And this time we're going to do 2 more of the important Union generals, and not without some controversy for both of them, but we're going to be doing George Gordon Meade and William Tecumseh Sherman. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.